Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're connecting from. I'm Jessica Belmont, communicator of the World Bank, and I'd like to welcome you to this event that we've organized within the framework of the 27th UN Climate Change Conference, the COP27. Today, we will be presenting the new report on climate and development in Argentina, and we'll talk about climate action and how it can drive economic growth in the country. Importantly, we'll look at the priorities for making that transition to development that is inclusive, resilient, and carbon neutral for 2050. To begin, I invite you to listen to Jordan Schwartz, Director of the World Bank for Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Please go ahead. Thank you, Jessica. Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to this session where we will be analyzing Argentina's potential for promoting its economic development in the context of a changing climate. Today, we will talk about some of the big challenges facing Argentina, such as how to balance its need for growth over the medium and long term in the face of the challenges presented by climate change, or how to define which investment policies should be prioritized, and how to align these policies with its climate objectives. The answers are not easy, and they impact each sector of the economy and society. We know there are no magic solutions, but one thing is certain: to find the answer, Argentina is going to need to develop a comprehensive vision that is transformative based on data and analytical models that provide policy options that can be progressively introduced and that drive economic growth that takes climate action into consideration. And this is precisely what can be found in our report, Climate and Development in Argentina, that we are presenting today. It studies Argentina's commitments to climate action together with its development priorities and considers the challenges it faces due to climate change. It focuses on the sectors of the economy that have the greatest potential to contribute to a future that is more resilient, inclusive, and low carbon. And it does so based on a study that analyzes the impact on its people, and particularly the most vulnerable, who are the most affected by climate change. It's a study carried out by experts who have an intimate knowledge of Argentina. We already know that Argentina's economy depends heavily on its natural capital. As the country director for the World Bank, I have seen the wide expanses of the Pampas, where a large portion of the global food supply is produced. I've seen the mountains and valleys of the Andes, which produce the best high altitude wines of the world. I've been to the dry forests, where indigenous communities harvest the sweetest organic honey I've ever tried. This is a country that depends not only on its enormous natural capital, but whose population is increasingly affected year by year by its vulnerability to climate change. I was recently in Chaco and Salta, where we could see how climate change is producing increasingly longer periods of drought and heavier floods. Floods have a deep impact on the people who have losses of assets, goods, and their own well being. And the droughts have the greatest impact on the economy of the country, affecting growth, tax revenues, and the fair distribution of resources. Now, the good news is that Argentina has already begun to change to ensure that it is less vulnerable and to better insert itself in a world that is transitioning towards carbon neutrality. Since 2010, it has reduced its deforestation, thus achieving progress in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. Elsewhere, renewable energy, especially wind and solar energy, constitute an enormous opportunity for it to advance towards a low carbon economy. Argentina has increased its use of renewable energy over the last 10 years from 2% of power generation to more than 10%. With its vast lithium reserves and its rich human capital, Argentina can develop the value chain of that product and become a central player in the world's energy transition. We also see opportunities for green growth that could open new markets and generate employment. Today, for example, green jobs account for double the number of jobs in polluting sectors. At this event, we would like to invite you to exchange ideas about how we can drive Argentina's growth with a focus on green growth. How can we improve the quality of life of Argentinians while reducing vulnerability to climate change? And how can Argentina lead the climate action that the country and the world needs? Thank you very much, and I will leave you with a presentation of the report. Jordan, thank you for sharing your vision on the potential for Argentina in this global transition and for being here today. Now I have the pleasure of presenting one of the authors of the report, Climate and Development in Argentina, Julie Rosenberg. She is senior economist at the World Bank. Julie, thank you for being here today. And to begin, I'd like to hear about some of the main findings of the report. Please go ahead. Thank you very much for the introduction. I will now give a short presentation about the report. Argentina has already suffered the effects of climate change. The drought in 2018 resulted in a 31% decrease in soy production and worsened the economic and financial crisis. The drop in GDP this year was twice what it would have been without the drought. Furthermore, vulnerable households are suffering from floods on an almost yearly basis, and the damage to houses and property cannot be compensated by benefits through social transfers. This is why we cannot separate climate change impacts from development issues. At the World Bank Group, we carried out this report on climate development in Argentina to analyze the impacts of climate change and propose policies to address them within the context of Argentina's objectives of reducing poverty, increasing GDP growth, and achieving better well-being for its population. The report contains good and bad news and a plan to integrate climate action into Argentina's development plans. I will begin with the bad news. Argentina is facing risks related to climate change, which threaten its growth and poverty reduction. By 2050, droughts could reduce GDP by an average of 4% each year. Flood-related losses could double, and 2,000 more deaths could be caused annually due to extreme temperature changes. This is why Argentina needs to invest in adaptation, for example, with investments in water storage, irrigation, and flood protection. But adaptation alone is not sufficient. As long as global GHG emissions continue to rise, the impacts of climate change will worsen to levels that we do not know how to manage. This is why all countries need to reduce their net emissions to zero between 2050 and 2080. But these global efforts could potentially create new problems for Argentina to overcome. The country exports goods such as soy and beef, which are responsible for emissions through methane and deforestation. At least 4% of exports could be threatened by new regulations from the European Union and the United States, which could prohibit the import of goods that generate deforestation. But the good news is that the transition to carbon neutrality also presents big opportunities for Argentina. Argentina could provide many of the products that will be in high demand in a carbon neutral world. For example, The country could produce 20% of the world's demand for lithium by 2030, and it could be competitive in the production of materials for electric vehicles. The country could also be competitive in sustainable agricultural products. Argentina has already begun with eco-labeling and implementing sustainable agricultural techniques, and it has already reduced deforestation in recent years. Furthermore, Argentina has an enormous renewable energy potential, which could help the country achieve carbon neutrality by 2030 at a very low cost. It could promote the use of electrical vehicles through renewable energies and produce green hydrogen, and this could help decarbonize other sectors of the economy. In this report, we show a possible roadmap for how Argentina could achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Certainly, there are other paths it could take, and Argentina will build its own roadmap, but this report gives an idea of the challenges and opportunities. Our scenario foresees investment in renewable energy, the electrification of transport and industry, an increase in efficiency in agriculture. We consider these key components for achieving carbon neutrality. Also key to achieve these changes is a series of public policies that give the right signals to the private sector, protect the most vulnerable, and bring economic benefits. For example, strategic public investment in water infrastructure, energy efficiency, and the promotion of incentives for the private sector in transport and energy. These are key measures for a fair transition, as is the development of capacities that will be needed for this transition. To conclude, Argentina has a lot of challenges ahead of it, but there are a lot of opportunities, and it could benefit from the global transition to carbon neutrality. Now is the time to accelerate the actions in these areas on this path towards a greater resiliency and low carbon economy. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'd like to invite you to download the report and learn more about these issues. How interesting. Thank you so much, Julia, for introducing some of the challenges and the opportunities that Argentina has before it, and for helping us think about how can we accelerate that transition to carbon neutrality. Argentina is already starting its work, but the challenge is to accelerate these actions. Now it's a pleasure to present Marco Lavagna, who is in charge of the Secretariat for International Economic and Financial Affairs of the Ministry of Economy of Argentina, and the Secretary of Climate Change for Argentina, Cecilia Noccolini, and Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, the Vice President of World Bank for Latin America and Central America. We will be looking at the challenges and achievements that Argentina has ahead of it in terms of meeting its commitments and in driving growth at the same time that it increases the well-being of its population and decreases emissions. It's no small feat. Thank you so much for being here and for participating in this conversation. And to begin, I'd like to turn to Marco. As you know, for a long time, there was a dichotomy between development and the environment. What is your vision of this dichotomy, and how can Argentina advance towards an inclusive, resilient, and carbon neutral development? Please go ahead. Indeed, for a long time, there was that dichotomy between development and the environment. And the fact is, they're concepts that cannot be separated. They cannot be considered independently of each other. Fortunately, since 2000, with the MDGs and later with the 2030 Agenda and the signing of the Paris Agreement, countries have advanced considerably in the coordination and incorporation of measures that tend to development, but at the same time care for the environment. It's important to understand that not all countries have the same responsibilities or are they in the same conditions to address this challenge. But working together is very important. Argentina is firmly committed. In 2019, it created the Climate Change Ministry, which seeks to coordinate at the national level all of the actions related to decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. In 2020, within the Ministry of Economy, we created the Technical Group for Sustainable Finance. And this also has to do with how resources are generated that are related to caring for the environment while taking into account development. But I have to be clear, these actions can be taken by countries on an individual basis, but they're not sufficient. They need to come hand in hand with coordinated efforts between countries. And they also require an expansion of resources to finance the transition towards development models that care for the environment. This is something that we have to work on with multilateral organizations and in different international forums where we can put into practice the work that all of us, I believe, agree on. As I said, since 2020, we've been working on new financial architecture, which is what the world needs, but we need to advance more rapidly. All efforts need to be coordinated and they need to be financed if they're to be successful. Excellent. Thank you very much, Marco, for participating. And now I'd like to hear from the Secretary of Climate Change for Argentina, Cecilia Nicolini. Cecilia, Argentina just presented its new climate change adaptation mitigation plan. What are the major challenges you see for its implementation? Please go ahead. The 2030 Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Plan is a big milestone for Argentina's climate policy. It's a state policy, and it reflects the country's commitment to the climate agenda because it's also the result of debates and agreements, and it is sustained by the participation of more than 8,600 people who discuss this sustainable future we want to have for Argentina. And what's interesting is that the development involved all of the different ministries, as well as the provinces, the private sector, the scientific community, civil society, unions, indigenous communities, all of these sectors which help to strengthen the goals and strategic lines and measures it includes. And they will continue to be part of it because we understand that climate action requires continuous improvement. Now, the big challenge we're facing is access to the economic resources and the financial mechanisms that will allow us to implement the 250 measures included in the plan through different projects that are scalable and that contribute to the country's growth. And we want them to be environmentally sustainable, but also economically and socially sustainable. Furthermore, we feel Argentina has a lot to contribute to the global transition to sustainable development. We have technical and scientific capabilities. We have projects such as CARIM, which is the first 100% Argentinian nuclear reactor. We have the potential of all of our common goods, such as the winds of Patagonia for wind energy, solar energy that can be generated in more than half of our territory, and an enormous potential for hydrogen production. And as Secretary Lavagna just said, in order to take advantage of all of these opportunities, we will need financial support, and if we want, we need to be able to include innovative mechanisms such as debt for climate action swaps or payments for ecosystem services. These are things that we've mentioned at the COP and in different international forums. And above all, just as we are committed to our climate goals, we need developed countries and international organizations to commit to financing the transition of the countries of the global south. We want to be part of the transformation. We have a plan to do so, and we're committed to implementing it throughout our entire territory. Thank you so much, Cecilia. It's so interesting what you've said. And now I'd like to go to Felipe. Felipe, the climate change agenda is gaining more prominence among the priorities of the World Bank. And I'd like to ask you, can you explain how the thinking's evolved and the relationship between climate change and development? Yes, of course, Jessica. This issue of climate change is something that is already being evidenced very strongly in the region. In most countries, there's already an understanding of climate change because they've already been impacted by climate events that have been very intense. Hurricanes in the north, in the Caribbean, and Central America. In the south, it's been more associated with droughts and floods. Recently, I was in Argentina, in the north of Argentina, and in Paraguay, where there was a tremendous drought that really impacted agricultural production and the lives of the people in the area. It also affects drinking water. I visited indigenous communities that are having problems due to climate change to be able to access water. So it's already impacting the development of Latin America. And there's a demand by the countries for support from the World Bank, but there are also opportunities. This transition that we're seeing in the world towards a lower carbon development or decarbonization also generates opportunities. For example, there's lithium and copper, which are products that are going to have an extremely high demand in terms of batteries and the new technologies that we're going to need. Argentina has an opportunity there that is tremendous. And then there's the issue of agriculture, which is really a comparative advantage that we see for countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, which are breadbasket countries in the world. We're in a time where the climate is becoming unpredictable, so we have to invest a lot, and we're really supporting, especially Argentina, in what we're calling climate smart agriculture. How can we produce, for instance, with a more efficient use of water? How can we maintain water reservoir levels? How can we use it in a more efficient manner? And how can we develop technologies to help farmers endure these climate change events? Thank you very much, Felipe. The environmental agenda is certainly a priority for countries in the region and clearly for Argentina as well. Here, I'd like to go back to Cecilia because I'd like to ask her a specific question. After the Forest Act was enacted, Argentina was able to reduce its deforestation. How can we maintain that trend of conserving native forests in the face of encroaching agricultural expansion? What can you tell us? At the Ministry of the Environment, we believe that the main challenge is to stop deforestation. Today, the main cause of deforestation in Argentina is the advance of agriculture and real estate, as well as forest fires, which in many cases are the product of climate change. And it is precisely through the Forest Act that we have developed and implemented technical tools and agreements to drive development, rural and agricultural development that is free from deforestation. And at, from the national government level, we are continuing to promote lines of work that are related to developing techniques and technologies for the prevention of forest fires. We're also working with oversight and control to ensure compliance with the law, and we're strengthening our supervisory and technical teams. And our aim is to increase the National Fund for the Enrichment and Conservation of Forests, which was created by the law, in order to carry out actions that supplement the international financing that we are receiving. As we know, forests are essential and very important in addressing climate change, especially for our agenda, which is the adaptation agenda as well, because forests help with issues such as water sources and regulation. They help support that water cycle. And so, as part of this law, we've really promoted within the climate change adaptation mitigation plan different measures for conservation and sustainable management of forests. Thank you so much, Cecilia. I wish you the most success in this initiative and in your efforts to reduce deforestation. Can we turn back to Felipe? There's been a lot of discussion over the past few days about the role of multilateral development organizations in terms of financing a fair transition, not just in Argentina, but in all emerging countries. Argentina aims to advance in terms of financing, regulatory changes, and public policy. What is the role of the World Bank in accompanying the efforts of Argentina in terms of strengthening its resilience and transitioning to a low carbon economy? Yes, we're very interested and we're already supporting Argentina in this transition towards a new world that is less dependent on carbon. We already have projects, for example, in drinking water, in water harvesting in the more arid regions of the country, for example, the north, where we're harvesting rain and collecting that water in reservoirs. Then there's irrigation systems we're developing in agricultural areas. In the Chaco, for example, which is an area that has relatively few water sources and is impacted by climate events. Going forward, I see a role of the bank in terms of supporting Argentina in creating resilient urban infrastructure and to help Argentina make that shift to a cleaner transport that uses lower emission vehicles, hopefully electric vehicles, and towards an energy matrix that incorporates more renewable energies, that Argentina takes advantage of its resources in terms of wind and solar energy and other renewable energies. And finally, I'd like to underscore the importance that we're giving to helping Argentina with its forest resources, because unfortunately, Latin America's biggest contribution to CO2 emissions is through deforestation. Argentina has very important forest resources, for example, in the Chaco, in Misiones, and also in Patagonia. These forest resources capture a lot of carbon. They're a very important source of balancing carbon throughout the world. And they also generate other benefits. They're sources of biodiversity, and they're also areas that generate a lot of tourism for local economies and for families that live in the area. We'd like to accompany Argentina in protecting that biodiversity, in protecting its forest resources, and in terms of developing programs such as for tree planting and reforestation, and developing areas for timber production. Very good. Thank you very much. I know that this is an issue that is being widely addressed at the COP27, and international organizations are taking a prominent role in terms of financing this transition to low carbon economies. Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to Marco now. Marco, Argentina has extraordinary natural resources and plays an important role as a global food supplier. How do you see Argentina's economy developing over the next 20, 30 years in the context of a world where the climate impacts will be even greater and where countries are going to depend on the resources produced by those countries that produce the main food commodities? Please go ahead. Thank you. Indeed, over the next couple of decades, we're going to face two challenges. One, how to continue to produce more food for a growing population, and at the same time, how to increase production in the context of a world that's facing higher vulnerability due to climate change. And how can we do it without expanding the borders of our agricultural production? It's very important for countries such as Argentina. We've produced over the recent years an average of 200 million tons of proteins, of which 46 million tons are soy, 20 million tons of wheat, 56 million tons of corn, and 4 million tons of sunflower oil. And basically, most of this production is destined for export markets. But it's not enough. We need to continue to increase production. And in order to do so, as Cecilia Nicolini said, we need to invest in innovation. Argentina has a long road ahead of it in order to successfully incorporate technology into its productive system, including biotechnology, zero tillage, precision agriculture, agroecology, animal welfare, and other measures. But once again, it won't be enough. What is missing is more coordinated work among countries to be able to achieve the appropriate transfer of knowledge, the transfer of technologies, and that's fundamental if we are going to continue to increase production. And it's important to consider that within this context of a food crisis, we cannot continue to have tariff barriers in the market. We need transparent trade, free trade that is accessible and that will allow us to align all of the incentives plus the financing of the infrastructure, as we talked about before, which will allow us to increase the productivity of the quality food products that we provide. Thank you very much, Marco. And thank you to everyone for sharing your vision about how a country like Argentina can take advantage of the opportunities in this transition towards a low carbon world and achieve stronger economic growth. The report is very interesting and thought provoking, and it contains good ideas and proposals to help us think about how Argentina can progress towards carbon neutrality at the same time as it grows, and importantly, as it grows but improves the quality of life of its inhabitants. Thank you to everyone for accompanying us today in this event. We hope that you've been able to learn more about these climate challenges that Argentina faces, as well as the opportunities it has to lead the climate agenda towards 2050. I'd like to invite you to read the Climate and Development Report. You can download it by scanning the QR code on your screen. We'll also put it on our webpage, and we'll put a link on our social media. Thank you very much for being with us. I'm Jessica Belmont, communicator of the World Bank. Goodbye.